So I thought I could make a helpful tutorial about my work process, but it turns out my brain is a pile of goop, and I tried my best, but I'm not sure it worked. I think there's a possibility this actually could help somebody in some way, so I have a moral obligation to upload it. If you are looking to animate a podcast, then you're going to need access to the sound files. There are any number of ways to do this, but we will just use CPod, a desktop podcast listening client. It's free. I think it's open source. Once you have it downloaded, you just go to the downloads directory in the settings and copy the location of that, and then paste it into your file explorer, so you don't have to spend a bunch of time navigating folders. You just copy and paste that in there. That's my one weird trick. You're definitely gonna want to just make a new folder for this whole project, and I really can't understate the importance of keeping all of these files organized instead of just being a huge mess in one directory. Next, we'll just open a video editor and put the podcast file into it and select our clip. I'm using Kdenlive here. It's a cross-platform free video editor. It's not really my preferred video editor. I usually use Vegas, but I am using this just to demonstrate that you can do this with completely free software. Just jump around randomly in this until I found something that's really short and easy to animate for this example. Luckily, I got it on the second try. Thank you, Carl Tart.
Yeah. Yes.
2 men, 2 women. Are we about to have an orgy in here?
Yeah, a lot of this footage is just me struggling with the interface for Kdenlive because the scroll bar at the bottom is really hard to see, so I'm just using my mouse wheel instead of scrubbing through with the little horizontal scroll bar. Look, the title of this video said it was excruciatingly boring, but you know, that's how it is. It's just how it is, folks. I mean, it's boring to watch, but it's engaging to do. As I said before, it is incredibly useful to have an organized series of folders in your work project to keep things from being a mess. Here we actually export it as an MP3 instead of going through all of the trouble of making a whole new directory for the audio and then realizing you were trying to export it as a WebM. And there we go, now we're ready to draw a bunch of things. Please remember to save your work. Here we make sure that we're actually recording our screen this time instead of doing a tutorial for no reason because you forgot to record. All these tracks are from the YouTube music library and are free to use in your YouTube videos. Thank you to all you wonderful artists. Particularly DJ William. We can just go ahead and launch Krita. While Krita is launching, you can make some more folders to put files into so that you don't get confused when you're trying to work with them. I like to make a folder just named Assets and subdivide it from there. I'm going to close out all of the animation-related Dockers so that I can show you how to enable them because they are not enabled by default. All of the animation-related Dockers are helpfully under the Dockers menu, which seems obvious unless you're very new to Krita and you don't know what Dockers are. The Docker titled animation just controls playback. The onion skin Docker controls seeing outlines of the frames before and after the frame you're currently viewing, and the timeline lets you control what frame you're looking at. Here I'm configuring the onion skin to show the frames just before and just after the one I look at. The bars indicate the strength of the outline. Previous frames will be shown in red and future frames will be shown in green. You'll see this later. This is some advice I try my best to follow but don't always follow through with, but try to give your layers meaningful names immediately because they can really pile up and it can become very confusing to navigate your own drawing. Here I like to get an initial drawing down before I chop it up into layers, just because it's hard for me to think good with layers. Conceptually, I just do better if it's a huge mess and then organize it later sometimes. Really, truly, if this was like an actual project I was working on, then there would be a storyboard before this that I would have as a rough that I would then follow to fill in. I'm gonna try to use the YouTube chapters feature with a bunch of timestamps so that you can skip all this boring drawing, but if you like watching it, you can just watch it. But it takes a while. What if Mr. Dash had a little hat? I unintentionally ended up just making a copy of Dom DeMillo minus glasses here. I don't know what it is about dirty old men and wearing a flat cap. I don't know. It just makes sense in my mind. Once you've got everything drawn the way you like, you can start using the selection tool to cut them up and put them on different layers so that it's much easier to animate. Again, I must stress the importance of naming your layers appropriately, particularly at this stage, because you're going to multiply them. Just doing some little repairs from where I cut the eyes out. Because the eyes are going to move, you want to have something underneath there so that it's not just empty space when it grows or shrinks. Clean up the eyes. Just cleaning up the eyes. And we are going to go ahead and add that hat because I had an idea for how I would incorporate it into the animation in an amusing way. What if his head moved around and it like flapped around on the back of his head? That's what comedy is, folks. I mean, don't feel bad about spending a real long time struggling with a weirdly shaped object. I mean, it's a weird shape. Try to explain the shape of a flat-billed hat to somebody. You can't. It's not natural. just chisel away at it until it's done. I mean, sometimes there's just no other way. Sometimes you just gotta power through. Alright, here's some bad advice. I don't really bother naming the color layers that I put directly underneath the line layers because I just automatically assume any layer that's underneath a named layer is for color. It works for me most of the time. It still looks bad though. Watching this now, I'm unsure why I took the time to put such an intricate coloring job on this hat for a quick tutorial. I think I just like drawing plaid, I don't know. Usually for stuff like this, I'll go to there's a website that I can't remember the name of now that lets you make your own plaid patterns and you can export them. And then you can import them into Krita as a pattern and just fill it in with the bucket tool. But I drew this for some reason. You can turn off the visibility for the white background layer on Krita so that you can see the transparent pattern beneath it if you need to fill in things that are white, like eyeballs. Right-click on the timeline on the first frame and bring up the context menu and add a keyframe to the right. As you can see, I also hit that little light bulb icon on the timeline for that layer, which turns on the onion skin for that layer, so I can see what the first frame looks like, so I can draw the next frame. Or what I'm rather doing is drawing the two ends of it, and I'll add a middle frame that goes between them. Now we can just right-click on the first frame and add a new keyframe to the right, which then creates a blank frame between the two end frames that we can draw into. Now the usefulness of the onion skin is apparent. Some of the onion skin is green, like Shrek, and some of the onion skin is red, like Red Shrek. I could have done a better job, but I just wanted to make sure that in the final frame of his eyebrows lifting up that the wrinkles on his forehead were closer together. For coloring frames, if you leave the onion skin on, it will interfere with the bucket fill tool, so I recommend not using it. Also just kind of unnecessary. Sometimes it looks like you're just staring at your screen with nothing going on, but really, you're thinking. It doesn't make good TV though. Now we get Mr. Dash's head colored in. We'll be able to have his mouth and eyes move around on top of his face in a convincing way. Just moving your cursor around and activating and deactivating layers while you try to muster the mental capacity to choose your next action. Move the cursor on the timeline back and forth. Watch his eyes raise and lower. Alright, now it's time to draw mouths. I draw 7 mouth shapes. And starting from the first frame, I use the Insert Multiple Keyframes option from the context menu and I add 6 frames. The second frame I always set as the teeth frame, which I make do double duty as both the F and th sounds. Next is the frame where I have the mouth just barely open. Then the shape after that is the wide open mouth shape. After that, I do the tongue shape, which is more or less like the barely opened mouth, but there's a tongue visible in it. Next is the sort of round mouth. It's not the pursed lips ooh, but it's the oh sound. I usually only make the top row of teeth visible for this. Now we get to the ooh. This is pretty self-explanatory. Just make an ooh noise and then draw that mouth shape. Here I'm just doing the fill for the black of the mouth in on the line layer, so it's easier to color in the teeth and tongue. It's probably not really best practices, but it's what I'm used to. Add a new layer for the color, and then add 6 new keyframes. And this is pretty cut and dry. Zapping the teeth with that bucket fill tool is a little bit meditative. Sometimes it's a challenge. The advantage of coloring the black on the line layer is that if it's too hard to color, you can just, get in there with the brush tool and not have to worry about it too much. Don't really need to be too picky with what color you make the tongue, because it's really only going to show up in a tiny handful of frames most of the time. I'm not actually even sure it shows up at all in the finished animation. Keeping the frames for your mouth shapes uniform helps you train your brain to do the lip sync faster. If the mouth shapes are always in the same order, then you can learn how to do it really quickly. Here, just adding some wrinkles underneath the eyes to enhance the character of Mr. Dash, a man who is always on the lookout for an orgy. Once you start animating, you'll be surprised how much time you burn just cycling back and forth through frames just to double and triple and quadruple check that they look correct. Also, be sure to save your work if you've been working on the drawing for like 20 minutes. I have Krita set up to autosave, but I think it's also important to note to keep the source files for all your drawings in an easy-to-remember place with an appropriate file name. Okay, I honestly have no idea what I'm doing here. Is my brain broken temporarily? Am I even thinking? It's hard to say. Alright, it's time to start exporting all of these layers into PNG files that we can import into Tahoma2D. So, first step is to just hide all of your layers and then start working through them. Just do some near pointless touch-ups on this single iframe. make sure when you hit that render animation button that you're going to export these frames into the directory that you want. You'll notice that the first frame and last frame is by default 0 to 100. I have many times accidentally rendered 100 frames of something, so just make a habit of making sure this is correct. You have to realize that because it starts numbering at 0 if you have 7 frames of something like the mouth frames, then it will be numbered 0 to 6. Now, the single most important thing for rendering an image sequence to import into Tahoma2D or OpenToons is to have a period at the end of your file name. When you export an animation as an image sequence from Krita, you will have a string of 4 numbers appended to the end of whatever file name you want. And OpenToons/Tahoma2D only understands image sequences where those numbers are sandwiched between 2 periods. So it will be your file name, period, number, period, PNG. Oh no, we forgot to make a background, even though this animation example doesn't even really need a background. I just made one anyway. It's just for fun. Totally unnecessary. Just throw something together. Colors, shapes. I mean, that's a background. What more do you want? Might not even be fair to call these shapes. Make Mr. Dash appear layer by layer, then make him disappear layer by layer, thus completing the circle of life. Simba. Just to demonstrate the animation docker that I had never used throughout this whole drawing process, you can just set a range of frames for it to play and a speed at which it plays and just let it go. And you can watch it. And it loops. It can be useful. Also, not necessary exactly for this animation, but just to demonstrate some good layer hygiene once you finish a sort of cohesive unit of something. It's a good idea to make a group layer and just put it inside of a folder so you can toggle it on and off. If you are drawing a scene with more than one character, or even a character with multiple moving parts, this can help you a lot. Oh boy, now it's time for the final stretch where we actually open the animation program Tahoma2D so that we can assemble all of our stuff. Gonna go ahead and make a new project for this, and I'm gonna set that project directory to the directory we made earlier. This will create a whole bunch of new folders that Tahoma uses for its own internal organization. The fact that it makes so many of its own folders is a good reason to have an overall project folder. Otherwise, your hard drive will be a complete mess. I got it eventually. Okay, here's where having all of our files organized starts to actually pay off. Now we can just go into the audio folder and drag the audio file we want right onto the first frame. I mean, it'll put it in whatever frame you drag it to. Might as well be the first. Another important thing to understand is that when you import image sequences into Tahoma, is that if you drag a file from a sequence, it will import all of them in order. You only need to grab one file for this. If you drag them all in, it will create duplicate sequences for each file. I hope you can see what's going on here. The columns to the right are going to be what's on top of columns to the left. Once you import those frames into a column, then they're in there even if you delete them off of the XSHEET, aka the timeline, because Tahoma understands them as what they call a level, which is basically just like a flip book of all of the frames in that sequence. I just right-click and use the Fill in Empty Frames option from the context menu, and that will fill in all the empty frames with the last frame that's in that column. Here I'm going through the timeline and using the Q and W keys to flip between the different frames of each level. So with the eyes, I just want them to sort of like open up whenever I want to accentuate something that he's saying. This is where having memorized the frame order of the mouth shapes starts to really pay off, because if you keep it completely consistent between characters, then you can train yourself to flip between the mouth shapes as quickly as you can. I'm a little bit unhappy with my mouth shapes. I think I could do better. But I did choose these mouth shapes specifically because I wanted to have a reduced number of mouth shapes so that I could do a lot of lip sync really fast, and I think it does generally work. You want to get to the most extreme and recognizable mouth shape for each sound as quickly as possible. You typically don't want your barely open mouth shape to be more than 1 or 2 frames. In this way, lip sync is not really that different from other kinds of movement on screen. The majority of it happens really quickly, and most of what you're seeing is the follow-through. It's just that the scale is like 1/24th of a second most of the time.
Yes.
2 men, 2 women. Are we about to have an orgy in here?
Alright, and that's the lip sync. Alright, now we're going to use the plastic tool to give this talking head a little bit more life. The plastic tool creates, I guess, a mesh that can then be deformed with bones to make a wibbly-wobbly sort of character that I like the way it moves and looks. The thing about the mesh is that it can only deform frames that are encapsulated by it, because Mr. Dash's eyeball and eyebrow sort of expand out from the face. They're sort of like floating on top of it in a cartoony way. When we create the mesh using the Create Mesh tool, it's not big enough by default, so we're going to need to pump it up and later manually edit it to encapsulate the protruding eyeball so that everything will be stuck to the face properly. Alright, now we just choose the build skeleton mode from the plastic tool submenu, and you want to drop at least, I think, 3 or 4 bones in there, or else the bones just end up rotating the mesh. As you can see, we can deform the head itself, but none of the facial features are sticking to it. But we can fix that easily by binding the facial features columns to the mesh column. You can have as many columns as you want bound to the mesh. It's possible to do this through a complicated scene schematic page in Tahoma, but it's much easier just to select it from this drop-down menu that's directly on the column in the XSheet.
Uh-oh.
Alright, now it's time to start just wiggling around these bones at different points in time. I really recommend starting at the beginning and creating an initial pose for your plastic deform.
Yes. 2 men. 2. 2 men. 2 men. 2 women. 2 women. Are we about to have an orgy? Are we about? Are we about? Are we about to have an orgy in here? About to have an orgy in here? Uh-oh. Yes. 2.
I'm not really clever enough to have any like special tricks for animating this hat moving around on him like I want to do, so it's basically just hand keying in all the movements on top of his head. It's perhaps not the most elegant way, but it does work. To be honest, I still don't really fully understand the keyframe system in Tahoma. It seems like the first time you set a parameter on a column, like position, rotation, scale, or skew, it sets that as the default position for that column retroactively. I just mess with it until it's right.
Uh-oh. Yes. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Yes. 2. Men.
It actually takes me longer to do this stuff than it does to do the lip sync.
Yes. Oh. Yes. Oh.
I have a very unprofessional level of understanding for this.
Uh-oh. Yes. 2 men, 2 women. Two women? Are we about? Are we about to have an orgy? Are we about to have an orgy? Are we about to? we about to have an orgy in here?
Okay, thank goodness that's over. It's done. Now, I want to be able to move the head around. So, I'll just use that same trick from earlier and bind the hat to the head. I didn't bind it to the mesh because then it would only show up where the mesh was. You want to bind it to the head so that it follows the head layer around, which is itself moved around by the mesh.
Two women? Are we about to have an orgy in here? Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Yes.
Two men, two women? Are we about to have an orgy in here?
Alright, it's finally time to render. We just want to make sure that we are going to save this as an MP4. And then we'll go through into the options and lower that quality down, because otherwise it will make a gigantic file size that wouldn't really impart much more quality, since it's just going to go up on YouTube anyway. I mean, if you're a real industry professional, you're going to want to be that. You're going to want to see that cranked up to 100, or maybe even exported as an image sequence, just so everything's as high fidelity as it possibly can be. But video compression doesn't have to work as hard if things don't move around as much, and with a cartoon like this, then, you know, you don't have to worry too much. You have to worry a little bit. It's going to spit the file out by default into the outputs directory of the fire siren. Here comes that fire truck. Here he comes. Burp, 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 burp. Burp, burp, burp. You know what real comedy is? It's imitating the sound of a fire truck while it's driving by. See you later, fire truck. Listen, the outputs folder of the project directory that Tahoma created, that's where it's going to go.